Here, I will be choosing to analyze Jackson Sun articles, as this is a major historical newspaper in the community. I pay for a subscription to the Jackson Sun online, which gives me unlimited access to their articles. In the description is a link to all of the articles referenced here so that you may read them in their entirety. This is the story of the Jackson 144. If you haven't seen the story of West High School or Monroe and the United States versus Jackson-Madison County School System, I encourage you to watch those first. So we know that West High School was absorbed by Southside in 1992. But what was Northside doing to keep up with the requirements laid out for them? Hiring black teachers was a required step. Their one and only black teacher rose to assistant principal and by 1992 was principal of Northside High School. Clarence Boone, who from what I could find remains Northside's only black principal, please correct me if I'm wrong. Clarence Boone has had much involvement in Jackson's community, graduating from West High School in 1957 and today is on the board of directors of Jackson's African American Chamber of Commerce. But before he was a principal, he was a student at Lane College. And in 1960, Clarence Boone marched from Lane College to the courthouse with 149 other people and were arrested for disturbing the peace. Now look, I'm not going to say that there was a purpose erasure of black history in Jackson, Tennessee. I'll let the Jackson Sun say that. There was an old clique here in Jackson in the 1960s. They didn't want anything to change. Among the things the paper didn't want to change was its interaction with the black community. The Sun, like many papers in the South, had been practicing racial discrimination in its hiring and in its news coverage for years. In the heat of the Civil Rights era, the Jackson Sun was owned by Sally Pigford, who had inherited ownership from her husband in 1945. The Pigfords were staunch conservatives with deep ties to the rulers of Jackson. They had ignored news in the black community for decades. Who were the 144? On November 8, 1960, 150 students gathered to protest voting restrictions on black Tennesseans. They marched peacefully from Lane College to downtown Jackson, where 144 of them were arrested. Luckily, the Tennessean was one of the few publishments prepared to cover the protests. From lunch counter sit-ins to business boycotts, the civil rights movement was just gearing up. So what happened to the Jackson 144? Well, the Jackson Sun did send a reporter and a photographer to the jail. He wrote a 22-paragraph story, which was then buried on page 11 of a 16-page paper. The photographs were never published. And then, people in Jackson thank the Jackson Sun and insist that burying race relations has kept the peace down. Here, I'll just read you some of these. The thinking seemed to be that if we published all that trash about Martin Luther King Jr. and the Selma protests, that the blacks in Jackson would become uppity and restive. That's just the way life was. Whites throughout Jackson often commended the Sun's civil rights era owners for helping keep blacks from stirring up trouble here. And we need to take a moment to address something here because the Jackson Sun continues to have this issue. Blacks and coloreds have been dehumanized for so long that it would be worth the extra step to refer to them as black people, as colored persons. This is just for those of you that just don't know what to call them these days. Call them people. They're people. And just one more comment. The man who actually went and wrote the article and took the pictures of the 144 also insists that the sun had a big role in the transition being as smooth as it was during integration and kept violence from being rampant. So where can we find the real history? Here is a book, a great book, that should be in print in every school in Tennessee, and I can't even find one copy. I was, however, able to find the excerpt that I needed regarding Jackson, Tennessee's history. Again, I really want this book. In the West Tennessee town of Jackson, whose population was more than 35% Negro, demonstrations were initiated by students from Lane College, a historically black school affiliated with the CME Church, whose headquarters and publishing house were also based in Jackson. The protest began on October 13, 1960, when students who refused to observe the Jim Crow arrangements on city buses were arrested. The arrest led to a boycott that within days forced the private bus company to desegregate its seating. Then, on October 27th, 5 students took seats at the Woolworth's lunch counter at around 11 a.m., and then white employees immediately closed the counter. They remained seated for 3 hours, reading books and the Bible. Eventually, a white mob gathered and dragged the students from the store. At the McClellan store nearby, 5 other students took seats at the lunch counter that afternoon. The manager called the police, who arrested the students. The demonstrations continued in the days ahead, and there were more arrests and abuse from white segregationists who kicked the students, cursed at them, burned them with cigarettes and coffee, spat on them, and pelted them with eggs and tulip bulbs. Among the demonstrators was Wesley McClure, a freshman who later became a president of Lane College. Albert Porter, a bookkeeper at Lane, and his wife, I don't want to say her name wrong, Fanye, served as leaders and advisors for the students and persuaded some faculty members to become involved. Porter, along with Lane professors such as Alan Ward, who was white, and Essie Percy, met with a local group of white Methodist women, and a biracial human relations council was eventually formed. Lane professor Preston E. Stewart was fined $15 for taking a picture of a whites only sign on a soft drink machine. In spite of the arrests and reports that police sometimes did nothing when segregationists abused the demonstrators, the local police department, under Mayor Quentin Edwards, generally avoided the sort of police brutality that occurred in other cities such as Birmingham, Alabama. The worst wave of arrests came on November 8, 1960, the day of the presidential election, when 144 people, including 66 women and 10 teenagers, were charged with parading without a license as they marched in downtown Jackson to protest the mistreatment of black voters in nearby Fayette and Haywood counties. A month later, a 30-year-old white man, and now I'll tell you, this excerpt was taken from a free example page of this book that I was able to find, and this is where this excerpt ends. This is all that I can actually show you without actually purchasing the book or having a copy of it. But I will tell you what happens next. A month later, a 30-year-old white man fired a shotgun into a Lane College dormitory. So something that the Jackson Sun Invisible Press article mentions is that these things would be plastered across headlines of newspapers today. So, is reporting different today? Well, here we see the Jackson Sun reporting favorably on the 2020 protests. They're clearly getting the point of what the protests are about, and they're including lots of pictures. However, here is WBBJ in 2019 reporting on a 2-day celebration of the reunion of the 1969 class of West High School with a few sentences and a single picture of a cake. And based on the comments on some of these articles, we still have a long way to go. November 8th, 1960. 144 college students are arrested after exercising their right to protest. 5 years later, Lane College holds a Freedom Day celebration honoring members of the Black community. One of the speakers to attend was attorney Emmett Ballard. He represented the 144 and for years was Jackson's only Black attorney. This Friday, June 19th, we will exercise our right that was denied to our brothers and sisters. I hope to see you there.